Hello, everyone. All right. Next up, we have Rachel Brink, and we are going to talk influencer marketing. Rachel was the CMO of Scentbird and has spent a lot of time in influencer marketing. I think you're really going to enjoy this session. We're going to go from micro to macro and everywhere in between. Rachel, I will let you take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Derek. Excited to be here and, very excited to talk about influencer marketing, the transition, thinking through your strategy with micro to macro influencers. I think there's a lot of talk about influencer marketing right now, about what's working, what's not working, how platforms are evolving. So hopefully this is helpful for everyone. So the first slide, I think the first thing to think about when you're looking at influencer marketing is to think about your approach in terms of tiers and the size of influencers. And I think this is true regardless of whether you look at the more established platforms like YouTube or Instagram, or you're looking at TikTok or Pinterest, or really any of the influencer platforms. It's really about looking at a funnel of how your bigger players play into it, how your smaller players play into it, how it's going to help your brand, what's going to be more effective and more relevant for your brand. Because different sized influencers, different levels of followers, have different levels of engagement, have a different relationship with their customers, which also has to do with their platform. So I think everybody thinks influencer marketing, and they think of those macro influencers, that A tier where you're looking at, the Kim Kardashians, the millions and millions of followers. And what you need to keep in mind for that level of influencer, whether it's on, as I said, YouTube or Instagram, is that they're really about reach and awareness. So you have to think, if your objective is really about building reach, about getting people to know your brand, then these are the right people for you. But understand that their conversion rates are going to be much lower. Once you get to that scale, your engagement rate is much, much lower. And what you're going to end up facing is that you're paying for those millions and millions of influencers who may or may not be relevant for your brand. So, there are pros and cons with those huge, huge influencers. I think the B tier, and again, these tiers, these definitions do vary from place to place. But I tend to think of that B tier as like 500,000 to 100,000, but there is leeway. And again, these are also reach and awareness plays, but they tend to have a more intimate relationship with their followers. So when you see a YouTuber that has 300,000, 400,000 followers, or on Instagram or even TikTok, they tend to respond more to their comments. They tend to be more sort of day-to-day. They haven't quite blown up. A lot of them have followers that have been with them for a while and really trust them. So you might do better in sort of going for that B tier. When you go to the C tier, these people can be very, very effective, sort of the 10 to 100,000, because they have the benefit of that intimacy, that day-to-day relationship, but they're small enough. They also are much more trustworthy. And then the flip side of it is, particularly if you're doing a paid placement with an influencer, you're not paying for that many followers. So you're going to see that these people give you a better conversion rates, maybe a better CPA, even though the reach might not be as big. And then there are the micro influencers. And there's been a lot of talk about micro influencers. I think micro influencers can be incredibly helpful to a brand. Obviously, a lot of them are very authentic. They have a very intimate relationship with their brands. The really good micro influencers are not really worried about getting paid. They're really worried about building an audience and building a relationship with that audience. So there's an opportunity to get unpaid placements, which is great for everybody. And I think what's interesting is you might find there are certain platforms where you might find that these micro influencers are already following your brand. I mean, unfortunately, the reality is, unless you're a very well-established brand or you're incredibly lucky, you probably don't have that many A-tier influencers that are organically following you. Maybe you got somebody to put it in their hands and they loved it. But the smaller guys might be following you already. And so if you are able to identify them and leverage them, you can get a very cost-effective way of building that trust and that conversion. So, I always like to open up this conversation about influencers, thinking about the tiers and the levels, because I think a well thought out influencer marketing plan really thinks about your objectives. What are you trying to achieve with influencer marketing? And then allocating a budget based on those objectives to what size of influencer you want. You can then drill down much more specifically into who those influencers are. But I think the first part is just to get an idea of who you want and why. And that can really sort of educate your strategy much, much better. The second piece that I always talk about is sort of creating the database. So again, here, I think the strategy needs to be very informed on what is your brand, who are you trying to reach. So think really hard about where your audience is already. Not only where are they, but where are they engaging. So for example, they might be on Instagram, but they might not be commenting on Instagram. They might not be engaging. They might just be passively viewing. Whereas on YouTube, they might be more engaged, or they might be checking out TikTok because it's cool, but TikTok might be too young for your audience. So again, really drilling down and understanding who you are and what your brand wants first is the most important step. And then step two is finding the influencers that fit that strategy. My advice always is to build your own proprietary database. You as a brand should own your influencers. You should know who you're working with, who works, who doesn't work. And the truth is, one thing I always talk to a lot of brands about is, they'll come to me and say, well, I tried influencer marketing and it doesn't work. And I'll say, well, how many influencers did you try? Oh, well, we tried 3 and they were huge. And that's a huge mistake that a lot of brands do. Unfortunately, influencer marketing is both an art and a science, and there's a huge amount of testing that needs to take place. So maybe you don't go for the large influencers if you don't have the budget, but I do recommend testing a large amount of influencers. And even when they do work, continue to broaden your database, continue to build it up so that you always have new influencers to leverage, new platforms to test. So how do you build this database? Obviously, there's a lot of platforms out there that can help you with building those databases, but I also highly recommend just sort of old school, build a Google sheet or one of the database management systems, get an intern and start sort of just creating a spreadsheet with exactly what information is important to you, what type of influencers do you want. Because even if you're going to use a platform, if you really drill down and understand the type of influencers that work for you, it'll be much easier to identify who are the good ones later on, even though you're using a platform. So one of the best things that I would say is to start with YouTube and start by searching who are your competitors on YouTube and what influencers are covering your competitors on YouTube. This is time consuming. You're going to have to sit down. You're going to have to listen to those influencers. I highly recommend reading the comments and seeing if these influencers, particularly if they're going to be expensive influencers that you're going to hire, if they're getting good comments, positive comments from the audience saying, hey, I love this product, it's interesting. Because the last thing you want to do is sort of assume that, oh, because this influencer covered X, Y, and Z, they're going to be good for me. Well, find out first if they even converted for your influencer, so for your other brand. So go through the search of competitors. The second part is just create that sheet. So their handle, and one piece of advice, always use the handle that's on YouTube or Instagram, because sometimes they change their names, but the handle will remain the same. The name, because you want to be personal. When you write to them, you want to be like, hey, Madison, love your channel, love X, Y, and Z. So that's really important. The number of followers, and this is challenging because obviously the number of followers changes, and there are some platforms like Social Blade where you can check and see the growth of the influencers, but it's good to get a snapshot of that point in time when you were looking at them, because it'll give you a good reference point of how quickly they're scaling. Average views. Here, it is super, super important. it's not just the size, it's the views that they're getting, or on Instagram, at least for now, the number of likes until things change up, and we'll see what happens then. But understanding how many views they're getting on average for the videos, and particularly spend time to understand the type of video that you have. So for example, if you're a game and this is a beauty influencer, but every once in a while she'll review a game, have a look and see if they're reviewing other games, how did those do? Were they very popular or very unpopular because it's not the common type of content that they do? So that's one thing that's really important. Same thing if you're doing Instagram, how many likes are they getting? If it's a beauty influencer, but every once in a while they'll do food and you're a food product, have a look, understand how your category does within that influencer. The content type, something to keep in mind. We'll talk about sort of the type of tests that I recommend running. But one thing is to look at the type of content. So for example, at Scentbird, we started with a lot of beauty influencers and unboxing videos and beauty videos. But, as we grew and as we wanted to expand and look at less competitive segments, we started to look at mommy categories, DIY, home decor. Well, some worked, some didn't work. So keeping really good track and really understanding what adjacent categories in terms of content type work is really important, because that'll help you, again, design a really good influencer marketing platform. And obviously the contact info is super important because you're going to have to reach out to these people. As I said, you can use a lot of platforms that will have that contact info for you, but it's great to own the contact info. So for example, if you move to another platform and you no longer have the history of the conversation, you have a way to reach out to this influencer. You might, even if you are talking back and forth with the influencer on a platform, sometimes if they're not responding, you might want to send them a direct email. So it's really helpful to get those emails. And the easiest way to get those emails is to dig into the About section, where you will see that they usually list the email. One thing to think, one little hack is that if you find an influencer doesn't have their email address on YouTube, oftentimes they'll have it on their Instagram. So check both to see what they've got. And again, these influencers are really sort of building their own brand. So a lot of them are not limited to one category, to one platform. So you might find somebody who is on YouTube and Instagram, but is really building up their TikTok. And if you want to test out TikTok, they might be willing to give you a better rate just to test out that platform. So always mark what platforms they're active in, how big they are in the different platforms. You can also negotiate something where they promote your product across the different platforms. So that's something to always keep an eye on. So the next piece is, okay, so now you've identified your strategy. What do you want to do? Second piece is, what are your objectives? How much do you want to spend on the A, the B, the C, the D? What are the best channels for you? So then comes how do I work with these people? So what I would tell you is there's a lot of platforms out there who say, we're a one-stop shop, we work with everybody. In my experience, different collaboration channels are better for different types of influencers. There are, for example, really great platforms that are wonderful for those micro-influencers, for identifying exactly the influencers that follow you already. So that's, I would say the paid platforms are good for those micro-influencers, but there's also just direct outreach. You might identify somebody just from comments on your Instagram and want to reach out to them and give them product. So, sorry, I'll start sort of from the A tier and work out. The thing about the A tier is that you will find them if you subscribe to any of the collaboration platforms, whether it's FameBit or Aspire or Grapevine or any of those, oftentimes they'll have the very, very large influencers. You're not going to get a response. So my advice when you're really looking for those people sort of 500,000 plus or 1 million plus is to figure out who is their agent. Often it is who is listed as their email on the YouTube channel, and reach out to them directly. These very large influencers are often, a couple of $1,000 deals or tens of thousands. So it's much better to negotiate directly with the agent. Sometimes some of these influencers manage it by themselves, but that's rather rare. So that's, you might get the influencer themselves, but a lot of times the influencer themselves will refer you to the agent to negotiate the deal. Sometimes you can say, hey, I'd love to send you a product just for you to try it, mention it if you like it, which is great. Those organic endorsements are great, but they're hard to control. You don't know when it's going to come. You don't know if it's going to come. So, something to think about. When you look at those 500,000 to 100,000, the paid platforms do much better. Again, I still believe in building that database. And the same, as I said, for the 10 to 100,000 is paid platforms, direct outreach, building the database. So, again, you have to sort of think about it in buckets of what size influencer you want, what type of influencer you want. A well thought out influencer strategy might also include, do you want to go very deep in one category? Do you want to own DIY? Or you might want to say, well, I just want to work with these 5 influencers and build a very deep relationship. All of those are different approaches that have worked for some people, have not worked for others. Personally, with Scentbird, we followed a more broad approach because what we found was that if you're doing influencer marketing on an ongoing basis, not just sort of as okay, we're launching something, we're reaching a bunch of influencers and then we stop influencer marketing, but you're doing it month after month after month, there is a point of saturation and exhaustion where, if every month the influencer is mentioning your product, her audience is going to start to think, well, is it sponsored? Is it authentic? I already heard about it. Either they like it or they don't. So what we found was it was better to sort of spread out the endorsements, even if there were people who were converting very well, who were doing very well for us, sort of use them quarterly and then rotate other people in between to have a more robust strategy. So the outreach piece, and again, I think that there is a lot of work being done right now with AI, with sort of ways to automate this because it does become very slow. On the other hand, these influencers are people. They're guys and girls that do this all day, and they know when it's a canned email. And just as your email marketing, if you're doing sales and you're just doing canned emails, it doesn't always work. The more you can personalize, the more you can be brief and clear and make them feel that you're really focusing on them and really want their channel. That's going to give you a much better response rate. There are tools like Persist IQ that really help because the number of emails that you're using is going to be very, very high. There are outreach tools within the platforms that I mentioned, which also help. But I think the key thing is don't think that you can replace, the tools enable you to be more effective, but you still need to add that personal touch, that sort of human connection to get the best results. The other piece I would say is you have to put yourself in the influencer's shoes in terms of the outreach. So obviously there's 2 ways to go. If you're going for just unpaid posts, you're going to have to get very lucky, and you're really going to have to sort of work your charm, make sure the influencer really loves your product and authentically wants to talk about it. And you're going to have to follow up a lot because they may like it. They might be open to posting about it. But if they have a couple of paid posts before, well, it always sort of falls on the wayside. And so making sure that you're sort of coming back up, making sure that you're sort of being opportunistic, because sometimes influencers that are doing a lot of paid posts are actually open to doing 1 or 2 unpaid just to make the video feel more authentic. So, be very smart and very strategic about the unpaid posts. When it comes to the paid posts, again, even when you're offering them money, the really popular influencers don't always answer. They're busy creating content. Some of them are busy in college. It is your job as an influencer marketer to remind the influencer that you exist, that you want to work with them, that you want to pay them. And the reality is you're probably only going to get a 30% response rate. That's just the reality of it. And if you're doing purely unpaid, the percentages go down. Point number 2 is around make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's. Get the agreement. Make sure you've discussed what are you expecting from them, how much creative leeway they're going to have, which my recommendation is to give them a lot of creative leeway, but very strong talking points. Make sure you are really they have a clear understanding and you have a clear understanding on what is expected. And sign a contract. I mean, listen, the reality is you don't really ever want to be in a position where you're going to be going after an influencer, and there's plenty of large companies who've tried it and tends to backfire. But you do want the influencer to understand that this is a business relationship. And even if it is an unpaid post, that they understand what are the expectations on your end, what are the expectations on their end. Because what I never recommend, even for unpaid, is just sort of spray and pray and sending out hundreds of products to people who've never agreed to talk about your product, because the chances of actually getting any influence out of that are very, very small. Sending the products, obviously, if you don't have a physical product, it's much easier. But if you do, be very organized. Make sure you're sending them the tracking link. It also makes the influencer feel important and feel special if they know that you care enough to send them a tracking link to say, hey, your product arrived. I see that USPS delivered. Again, all those touch points, all that opportunity to make it a relationship is what makes influencer marketing very, very successful. The review part. This is a tricky one because, as I said earlier, my view is that you should do all the work up front with the influencer. Make sure their content is the type of content you want, that you feel comfortable with their humor, how much they push the envelope, what language they use. I think where influencer marketing really breaks down and becomes disastrous is when there is a huge amount of back and forth and the brand is very unhappy with the influencer because they didn't want it this way, they didn't want it that way. Try to do all that work up front. For more complex products, I really recommend talking points. And again, don't provide a script because you don't want them to be reading from it. It's very transparent to the audience that they're reading from it. But it's more of, these influencers are busy. And so if you give them 4 or 5 talking points that are very clear, that are very easy for them to digest, they'll read it quickly and then they'll talk about your product in the way you want them to talk to. So do all that work up front so that when the influencer sends the post prior to posting, it's really just a check, check, check. Did they put the right link? Did they mention the right price? Did they mention the right offer? Things like that, rather than more essential, more important things. Review promptly. Again, the influencers, they're really under a lot of pressure to create a lot of content, and a lot of them are really sort of, down to the wire, creating the content that they're going to post the next day. This is particularly true of the smaller influencers. I think the larger influencers may have a team, may have people helping them edit, but the smaller guys, it's a one-man show, and they might be, up all night creating a video, waiting for you to approve, and we'll post it in an hour. So be respectful of that, build a relationship, get back to them. I would say within the day, ideally within a few hours. Always check the links. Because a lot of times they'll put /co, .co instead of .com, or they'll put the wrong coupon code or the wrong number, or they'll drop off a number. So always check those because it's much easier to check it and before it posts than after. And the other thing that I would say is, keep an eye out for when your post is going to go up. You might not have as much control if it's an unpaid post, but if it is a paid post, think about what makes sense for your audience. So for example, if you're looking for an audience that is in college, are there certain times when a college student would be more likely to be watching YouTube or checking their Instagram or checking TikTok? Also, in my experience, I would steer clear of holidays. they're very unpredictable. There's a lot going on around Christmas or Thanksgiving. They might be watching the videos. They may or may not be shopping. They may or may not be clicking on the links. So personally, I prefer to even if it's a holiday post, do it a couple of days before or after the holiday, rather than very, very close to holidays, because the viewership is iffy, the content is iffy. Also, the other thing to think about, particularly with YouTube, is that one of the things that's really great about YouTube is that it tends to have a long tail, because if you do a natural lip tutorial, well, that might be relevant now in August, but it might also be relevant in November or January. Whereas a holiday post, like, favorite look for Christmas, once Christmas is done, you have to wait another year for anybody to watch it. So again, doing things that are very thematic around holidays, I think if you're really invested in influencer marketing, if you've already done all the others, sure, but I would stay away from it initially and go for more evergreen content, because what we found with YouTube in particular is that the beauty of it is that you get a big bump, obviously, when it posts, but even months afterwards, you'll get a little dribble, but those dribbles, once you have a big base of videos that are out there with your brand, can add up to significant sales. Contract. So I talked a little bit about this in the prior slide, but again, whether it's paid or unpaid, I personally really like, you might want to call it a contract for paid. You might call it an agreement or something a little lighter with unpaid, because they're not paid. But always ensure that it is clear what you're asking for. For paid, make sure you have the rights to the content. This is probably the most valuable piece of data that I can give you, because that can really maximize the value of it. If you have the rights to an Instagram post, you can use it for a Facebook ad. You can use it on your page. Some influencers will ask you for extra fee for that. You'll have to figure out how much you're going to use it if it's worthwhile. But I highly, highly recommend being able to get the rights to the content so you can use it in other formats. FTC compliance needs to happen. I think the good news now is consumers are so used to it. It shouldn't be a big deal. Nobody's surprised by it. It's just a given. It's a hashtag ad or whatever needs to happen, but it should be there. Nobody needs to get in trouble because of that. The deliverables and the channel. It is shocking how many times I've had an influencer that I had said YouTube and they posted. They're like, oh, but I did a little video on Instagram. And I was like, no. This is what I want. So or I did an Instagram story. And I was like, that's great, but that goes away in 24 hours. So being very clear about what channel. Also, when you write that contract, write out the specific channel for that influencer, because a lot of time influencers might have two channels. So for example, they might have their main channel and then a vlog channel or a secondary language channel. So you want to make sure you know which one you're going to be on. The talking points. One little piece of advice with talking points, as I was saying, make sure you keep it short so they don't read it, because that kills the effectiveness. Obviously, it doesn't feel authentic when somebody's reading a list. And just to be safe, change up the order every once in a while, because what we found was when we were sending the same list to multiple influencers, sometimes they were all going in the exact same order. And again, people were picking up on it. It didn't feel authentic. It didn't feel real, because they were literally reading in the same order. The other thing is, just as when you're defining your brand, it's always helpful to understand what you are, but it's as helpful to understand what you're not. When you create those talking points, explaining the don'ts is very, very helpful. So for example, with us, with Scentbird, one of the things that we found is, influencers were always very excited to talk about the fact that it was a small travel case and it was great for traveling. But we also found that it didn't convert, because people didn't want a subscription that they would get every month for a product that they would only use occasionally when they travel. And so, the logic isn't bad. The influencer was trying to do their job, but you have more experience. You know what works and what doesn't work for your brand. So make sure you call those out. Bitly links and coupon codes, super important to track the performance of that influencer, particularly on YouTube, but also on Instagram and TikTok and everywhere else. So make sure you have those and repeat them often. Make sure they've got them right. And the right to review, as I mentioned. Hopefully you won't have to do a lot of edits. Hopefully you won't have to do a lot of changes, but you want to make sure the influencer knows you have that right. For unpaid, one thing we did just for expediency is just a Google form, and that seemed to work fine. So we didn't have to have contracts being back and forth and being signed. So that's just a little tip for unpaid sort of smaller collaborations. It might be sufficient. Tracking and optimization. As I said, the Bitly link is really, really important. For us, it allowed us to track how many conversions, because we could see on GA how many conversions were coming from each influencer. Make sure you ask them to put it above the fold, because that really helps with the conversion. And the big thing, as I was saying, with influencer marketing is you need to test and optimize. So make sure you're tracking every video. Make sure you're tracking, who was the video, when did it post, what type of video, provide the link, how many sales did it provide, how many views, how many visitors. Be very systematic in your list to understand, because what you're going to want to do particularly if you're just starting out, after a couple of, 2 or 3 months of testing influencer marketing, is to go back and be able to have some conclusions as to what type of influencers work for you in terms of size, gender, content type, thematics, etc. So you need to build up that data, make sure you're capturing all that data, because it's quite challenging to go back and rebuild that. So, my biggest piece of advice in terms of influencer marketing, whether you're doing macro or macro, is just to test. Make sure you have a well thought out strategy in terms of the size of influencers, what makes sense for you, the content, how many you can get paid versus unpaid, what type of talking points, keep it fresh, keep it relevant. And that's kind of influencer marketing in a nutshell. So I hope that's helpful. Derek, I don't know if you have some questions. I know that was quite fast, but hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I have some questions, some quick questions for you. The first one is, I still find this really hard to believe, and I am experiencing this with a very small influencer program that I'm launching right now. I'm trying to give people money and they won't respond to my emails. Why do you think that is?
I think that it really, part of it is only the very large influencers are professional influencers.
And then they're too busy.
They're just girls, they're just guys, they're kids in college that, have classes and other stuff. And yes, they want to make money, but they're not systematic, they're not organized. A lot of times it's a one woman show. And so that's where the follow-up really matters. And create tools for yourself to make that easy and fast. So that's where, like, having a script, having reminders, using something like Persist IQ, where, if somebody hasn't responded in 5 days, you send them another email, 3 days, another email, create a kind of a funnel for yourself really helps. But it's sort of crazy, right? Like, you're saying, well, I'm giving you money. Don't you want it? But they're disorganized. They're not all, a lot of them, it's their side gig. It's not their full-time job.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, and it makes sense. I guess that's the sad truth of influencer marketing, because obviously you laid out a really clear strategy here. I think aside from the strategy, it's just a lot of work, right? Like, in order to make the program robust, it's a lot of follow-up, a lot of email, a lot of phone calls, a lot of back and forth, probably negotiation that comes into this quite a bit as well, right?
So negotiations is super important. My advice is to really start with a very clear understanding of how much a video is worth. Because the way we looked at it was, we looked at a cost per view, a cost per like, as a starting point. So that's where, when I was talking about building your database and making sure you understand what the average views are, because that's what's going to help you price that video. It's not just because X, Y, and Z has 500,000 followers, but it's the fact that, she gets 100,000 views every time. So 100,000 views, what is it worth to you? And my advice is, the prices change by category, by segment. Generally, I would say, this is very broad, somewhere between 3 at the very low end and 12, 15 at the high end is a good range. So 12 cents per view to 3 cents per view. So just do the math. If it's somebody who's incredibly important in your category, if it's somebody who's just the right one and you think they're worth 20 cents a view, I think it's much easier to negotiate rates if you take that approach than just, well, every influencer that has 1 million followers has a $20,000. I've seen a lot of posts where they just go on the size of the viewership, so the size of the followers, and I think that's the wrong way to do it. I think you should look at the views specifically for your segment. What can you expect if this influencer creates a video or a post about you, and then negotiate from there.
I agree completely. And that actually seems really cheap, because you could pay that if I was doing YouTube ads, I might even pay more than 12 cents cost per view, and like with 3 cents at the low end. So I think that it's a fair price. You're getting somebody to create content as well. My final question for you is about, and I might have even asked this to you before, backlinks. So obviously on YouTube and Instagram, we're not going to get any value out of a backlink. But should I be using influencers to perhaps create a blog post and use that backlink for some sort of SEO juice? Have you ever seen that work for influencer marketing as just essentially better than boring backlink outreach, but not as much as, let's say, direct response influencer marketing?
It could work. I mean, it really depends on the type of influencer and whether they're blog. Because a lot of times what I've seen is there are particularly influencers who've been around for a while. They started with a blog and then they went to YouTube and then they went to Instagram. So what tends to happen is that the blog is kind of abandoned. So how much SEO value is it going to give you? Maybe 5 years ago it would have been better.
Okay, all right, that's a good point.
Yeah, so I think it's, but again, I think going back to the point of negotiation, the beauty of it is it doesn't have to be an either or. You can negotiate to say, hey, will you, and we do that with several influencers, where we would negotiate for a video, but then on their blog, they would link the video and then create a blog post with a link. So that would have the SEO value. So you're getting kind of a 2-for-1. And the more you sort of reinforce with the audience, the better. Also, those links have sort of a longer tail than just the video. So that's something that does work.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, is like blog post with a video embed, essentially. And then they send their email list to the blog post to read about what's going on. They can click the link to purchase from the site, but ultimately that blog post can help drive up the ranking of the place that it's linking to.
And I mean, the other thing to think about is, YouTube search. It's a huge category.
Yeah.
So also remember that all those links you have within YouTube, they don't count on the other SEO, but within YouTube, thousands, if not, millions and millions of people are searching. So you also have sort of that database that you're building as you have more and more influencers writing about your brand. People are searching for your brand on YouTube and trying to find out about it. And if you have credible influencers, that also builds it up.
Yeah, I love it. Awesome. All right. So we're starting our influencer marketing program tomorrow. What's the one thing you want to make sure people get right?
I think be very thoughtful about what you're trying to achieve. Number one, is it reach? Is it sales? Is it SEO? What are you trying to achieve? Do your homework on the influencers. I think so many people just want to get started and pick somebody big and don't even bother looking through their feed. So it is intensive. You do have to spend the time to find the right ones, because you want to have that authenticity. You want to have somebody who does well. There's a lot of fake, particularly on Instagram. Be super careful. Make sure they're real followers. They're real there's tools that can help you with that, but do the homework. I've seen people waste a lot of money. And the other thing is just test, always think of influencer marketing as a test and learn exercise. Even when you're doing well with it, even when you're scaling it, you always have to keep it fresh and innovative and continue to test. So if you're starting tomorrow, don't just put all your eggs in one basket and try 2 influencers and think you're doing influencer marketing.
Mm-hmm.
You're much better off maybe starting with smaller and a handful of influencers to start to understand your brand and how it works, and then scale up from there.
I love it. Awesome. Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to catch up.
And we've got your email address here. So if you want to talk influencer marketing with Rachel, you can reach out to her.
Thank you very much. Bye.